Okay, good afternoon and welcome to MEED's second webinar on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on business in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Richard Thompson. I'm the editorial director of MEED, and I will act as the host and the moderator for today's webinar, but I'm joined online by the rest of the MEED team and Ed James from MEED Projects, and so we'll try. That gives us enough capacity, hopefully, to touch on all of the areas of interest that you may have. Nabil, if we can skip to the next slide. So the agenda for today's webinar, I will present a couple of slides at the beginning just to sort of provide an update of the number of cases and some of the government actions that have been taken in the past 7 days. And then following that, we will do a series of industry updates, and we will look at some of the important stories that MEED has reported over the past 7 days, and try and tease out from those stories what the broader implications are of those events. And we have a list there of the MEED team who are joining us today on this panel. Once we've been through the sector updates, we will move into a Q&A session. This is a live streamed webinar, and you can submit questions as we go. If you use the tab at the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's a small tab that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can submit a question which I can see, and all of the panelists can see your questions, and we can then try and answer as many as possible for the remaining segment of the broadcast. And also, we have some questions that were hanging over from last week's webinar, which the team has been looking at, and we'll try and address some of those questions as well. Nabil, if you could skip to the next slide, please. So this presentation, just to sort of tell you who we are, for those of you who don't know, MEED is a business information service specializing in the Middle East. We've been running since 1957, and this presentation, this webinar is brought to you together with MEED and MEED Project. MEED Projects is the region's best project tracking service. Ed James, the Director of Content and Analysis from MEED Projects, is one of our panelists today, and if you have questions on anything relating to the project market, Ed is the person to deal with those questions. And then on the left-hand side, you can see meed.com, which provides daily news, analysis, and data from across the region. Next slide, please, Nabil. We have launched on meed.com daily coronavirus updates. These provide you with the latest statistics and a comprehensive list of the latest government actions and corporate sector actions in response to the crisis. So you can see the link at the bottom of the page there. That is updated by Neha, Bhatia, who is one of our panelists today, on a daily basis, and I recommend it's been unlocked for non-subscribers as well, just to provide the maximum support that we can. So if you do want to just sort of update yourself and get some numbers, you can find them on that link. If we can move to the next slide. Okay, just to summarize where we are in terms of the Middle East. As of this morning, 52,556 confirmed cases across the region. Now, of course, the case numbers have to be taken with a large pinch of salt. Not everybody is tracking cases or testing. Where testing is happening, it's not being done to the same standards in every country. And so I think the case numbers, it gives us one metric to follow, but they're not particularly accurate. It's more of an indicator. What is more accurate is the number of deaths, and currently across the Middle East and North Africa, there have been 3,125 deaths recorded as a result of COVID-19. On the table on the left, I've tried to create some sort of ratios of ratio of death to cases, confirmed cases, as a percentage. You can see in the fourth column there, in Iran, for example, 6.6% fatality rate compared to confirmed cases. That's a very high level. And you can see in Iraq also a very high level, 7.3%. Some of that will relate to the low level of testing rather necessarily than a particularly virulent strain. You can see in Saudi Arabia and most of the rest of the markets, it's much lower, below 1% in most cases. Again, these numbers have to be taken with a pinch of salt because it does depend on the testing regime. On the right-hand side, we can see the percentage of recoveries compared to confirmed cases as well. The other point to note, I guess, here on the right, we can see the number of cases and the rise in number of cases per country. This data is through March, and you can see it in more detail on that web link I just gave you. We've not shown Iran on the graph on the right because the numbers are so much larger in Iran than any other market that it really doesn't, it distorts the graph and we can't fit it on. So I've shown the Iran numbers on the right. Saudi Arabia, the biggest economy, the biggest population, inevitably the biggest number of cases, but a very low death rate you can see there, but it is rising across the region. The next slide, please, Nabil. So I might call in Neha to go through some of these points in some detail, but these are just some of the kind of government actions, government responses that we have seen in the past 7 days. So over the past few weeks, we have seen several rounds of economic packages, austerity measures, benefit measures being announced, and we've seen some more this week. Saudi Arabia is offering free treatment, COVID-19 treatment, not just to citizens, but to residents as well. And I think they've even extended that to people who are illegal residents at the moment. They're taking, as most of the GCC states are, they're taking very strong action to try and stop the spread of the virus. In the UAE, and we'll come on to this story in much more detail with Colin and why that has happened and what that might tell us in just a moment.
Richard, we seem to be having...
in the UAE, the Ministry of Human Resources are now...
Richard, we seem to be having some audio problems with you. Perhaps Neha, perhaps you could continue from where Richard left off with this slide.
I last heard Richard mention the UAE's support for the industries over here, the private sector industry. I'm sure Colin will be able to shed light on the Expo 2020 development. The UAE's Labour Ministry has worked to protect private sector jobs to the extent it can, the best it can, really, creating a virtual labour market where expats can register to work with more than one employer while the precautionary measures are in place to just curb the spread of COVID. Outside the UAE, Oman launched an austerity drive, well, fresh measures to add to its austerity drive yesterday. Government companies have been told to reduce their expenditure by 10% for the rest of this year. And they've also been told to put new projects and capital expenditure on hold. Now, this could affect the majority of planned projects that were due to go ahead, but this has perhaps as much to do with COVID as it does with oil, perhaps more to do with oil, in fact. Outside the GCC region, Egypt is also working quite hard to do the best it can, although its number of cases is higher than in some other GCC markets. They're conducting sterilization works at tourism sites. Doctor salaries have been increased so that people don't necessarily, stay at home and join the workforce while they can and help out in the best possible way. Egypt's tourism industry is going to suffer, according to most analysts, and that is understandable considering how much its economy relies on tourism revenues. But a lot of it at this point is just wait and watch and see what happens, depending on when the pandemic peaks or ends.
Okay. I'll cut in just there because we can go into some of this in a bit more detail. We have some survey questions now.
Richard,
if we could put them up on screen. We're going to do a mention on the screen. These are interactive, so you can vote using your cursor. If they are going to appear, I'll give it another 10 seconds, and if
Richard, your microphone is muted.
Okay, how would you rate the impact of the coronavirus on the project market as a whole so far? So this is really what you have seen so far on your business. So have you seen no impact at all? Have you seen a little impact, a moderate impact, or has we'll have respond this one? Perhaps your projects haven't yet felt any impact. So we shall give this another 10 seconds, and then we'll move on to the second and final question. Okay, thank you. Nabil, if we could have the second question now, please. Okay, so what is your view on how long the lockdown conditions will continue? So most markets in the region, if not all, are now in quite an extensive program of lockdowns. People are being encouraged to work from home. Social distancing is being enforced. Some countries have evening curfews, and airports are being closed and transport networks closed. So how long do you think, or do you expect, these conditions will continue? Will it be 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, which would take us up to the summer, or 6 months, which means going right through the summer? Obviously, there can be any number of permutations of these dates. So these are very sort of indicative dates that we've chosen on here. So if we'll give that, we'll give you 10 seconds to vote on this. And we will circulate the results. I don't know if these results will show during the webinar, but we will circulate them to all attendees. They're really just sort of indicative to gauge sentiment. Okay, thank you very much, Nabil. Let's go back to the slide deck. So we've had a quick summary of the regional overview. And I'm going to turn to Colin Foreman, MEED's deputy editor, for this. So 2 days ago, Dubai announced it was recommending, the steering committee for Expo 2020 said it was recommending a little bit about the story, Colin, and then why is this important?
Thank you, Richard. I mean, really, this has been the story that I think a lot of people have been looking and watching over the last probably 2 weeks. I would say a month ago, it was widely considered that, you know, the Expo was still continuing as planned, and it was almost dismissed that it could possibly be delayed. It's such an important event, and so many other events would need to fit around it. And I think as the severity of the health crisis around the world increased, it became more and more apparent that it was probably going to have to be delayed. I think the key moment really came last week when the Olympics got shifted by a year. I think once that happened, it became very difficult for the Expo to do anything else, really. The Olympics not going ahead in July due to major health concerns, it wasn't really feasible to then hold an event just a few months later and just think there wouldn't be any health implications. So it was in the end, it was a fairly expected decision that was made by Dubai 2 days ago to recommend that it does get delayed. That's still pending a vote from the member countries from the organizer BIE, but I expect that vote to go through, and I expect it to be delayed. In terms of timing, I would think it will probably follow what the Olympics has done and be a year later. So we're looking at an Expo 2021 in all likelihood. Question then shifts, what does that really mean? I mean, the sector that I write on quite a lot is the construction sector. The answer is mixed, really. I think from the actual Expo construction, the Expo people at Dubai were very keen about 3 weeks ago to say that most of the major construction was complete, and that is correct. If you look at the major infrastructure that was due to be delivered, such as the metro line, the various road interchanges, and then the major buildings that make up the Expo, they are pretty much complete. So I think in terms of how that affects the progress of construction on the major works, not really too much. There is work that's ongoing on finishing off pavilions and some of the other buildings. They have a little bit more time in theory now, but I would imagine that there'll be still quite a bit of pressure to get that completed promptly. So on the actual site and the direct infrastructure, I don't think there will be too much of an impact. I think what this possibly does is that some of the other building projects that were around in Dubai aiming to be completed in time for the Expo now have a bit more time to be completed. So that could be a slight positive. The other thing, just from the event point of view, which I think is worth mentioning, if the event had gone ahead in 2020, it really would have been an event that would really struggle. I mean, there's no international flights at the moment. People can't book flights ahead of the event. It would really have been quite a, if it was even possible, it would have been a damn squib. I think the prospect of hosting an Expo next year, hopefully this health crisis has passed. People could well be traveling again. So I think Dubai will see that as an opportunity to really put itself on the map again in the sort of post-corona world. And I think the other thing which is also important is that really there's been quite a lot of pace of change over the last really 2 to 3 weeks, with people being in lockdown, businesses having to adjust the way they work. We're doing a webinar, for example. And, you know, what does that mean for companies? What does that mean for businesses? What does that mean for society? And, you know, the Expo could be the first place where some of these issues are really tackled. So I try to see the positive out of the decision. I think it's a good opportunity for Dubai if the health crisis has passed by. They've got a very major world event which is coming through to really re-establish itself after what's probably going to be a very, very difficult 2020 for the whole world.
And of course, Colin, by delaying it to next year, you'll be ensuring that it's going to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the UAE as well. So added bonus to that.
Yeah, I think that's another good point. And I mean, some of the marketing that's been coming out of the UAE over the last few years has been talking about what's going to happen in the next 50 years. That's obviously links in as well. But I think looking at the more sort of near to medium term, really the Expo event, if it had gone ahead this year, and if we just assume for 1 second that the coronavirus crisis didn't happen, the Expo was really coming at the end of a cycle for Dubai in terms of building work. It was really the end of a project cycle. It was also the end of it felt like the end of an economic cycle that really was sort of limping through, and then there'd be the Expo. With what's happened now and with the probable delay, we're probably having the event hopefully at the start of another, as we're coming out of a downturn. So, you know, there's the opportunity there to try and use the Expo to try and push Dubai onto another growth cycle. So I think there's quite a bit of opportunity to look for there. And you know, it's not my place to speak on behalf of the Dubai leadership, but having observed them for quite a while, I would say that they'll feel that there's an awful lot to play for with an Expo in 2021, and I'm sure that's what they'll be focusing
on. Richard, are you there? Okay, well, I think Richard's had some sort of audio internet issues, so I'll just be moderating from now on. If we can go to the next slide, Nabil, please.
Yeah, Ed, if I just lead into this, I think this is linked to the Expo story in a little bit with what I was saying, in the fact that it's it's looking at sort of what's going to happen beyond this crisis. So if I let Neha come in.
So I think we've had two back-to-back days of major announcements. There was the Expo postponement, and then Dubai announced that it would inject equity into Emirates. Now, as we've chatted at the MEED offices earlier, this would be unprecedented because Emirates has historically provided dividend to Dubai through ICD, the Investment Corporation of Dubai, which is the sovereign wealth fund and the owner of Emirates. So for Dubai to provide funding to Emirates really firstly highlights just how serious the economic fallout of COVID-19 will be on the aviation sector and the wider economy within the UAE. But it also shows why Emirates is so important to Dubai, because it's over the years it's become almost, as Sheikh Hamdan put it in his announcement yesterday, it is Dubai's original success story. It is the airline that has really put Dubai's tourism and business proposition on the map. And so Emirates is not going to be allowed to fail, to suffer too much. Now, obviously, they've taken steps at Emirates to reduce some of this financial impact. They have reduced salaries for the next 3 months. They've cut flights, and all of that is, I think, indicative of just how badly the airline industry, the aviation industry is suffering. But I think just looking at how Dubai has responded to the situation so far, it would be safe to assume that Emirates will probably come back from the pandemic a little bit stronger and maybe even quicker than some other organizations and some other airlines in the GCC might.
Great. Yeah, I think clearly there's a number of different challenges that Dubai has to face. I mean, Emirates, of course, is perhaps one of the biggest ones. And I guess it will remain to be seen how obviously injecting equity into the airline will help support it in the short term. But I think in the longer term, questions must continue around Dubai's overall debt burden, especially with so much debt to be repaid over the next few years. So I guess this leads to larger questions around that. Let's go on to the next. Yes, sorry, Colin.
I think one other thing which I think is important to add just on the Emirates and the Expo, which they're very similar points, is that we don't really know what the world's going to feel like once this health crisis has passed. Are we going to have a world where people are afraid to travel? They're still frightened about viruses and they don't want to go out as much? Or are we going to have a world where people are just fed up with being stuck at home for long periods of time and they just want to go out as much as possible? Obviously, the answer won't be the same for everybody. But I think that a lot of what Dubai does or how successful Dubai is with Emirates and the Expo really depends on that question, really. And it comes down to human nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure a lot of us, the first thing we want to do after this lockdown, depending how long it takes, is to take a holiday somewhere. So yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens later. Okay, so we're going to go on to quite different area now, looking at oil and gas in Iraq. But before we do, just to remind you, just that please submit your questions. There's a Q&A button underneath where you can submit your questions. We are going to answer them in a Q&A session in a short while once we've gone through all the slides. So please submit them and we'll come to them in due course. I've also seen that there are a couple of questions about whether this will be available. As you might be able to see in the Zoom, we are recording this and we will be posting it on the MEED.com and MEED Projects websites in due course within a couple of days. So rest assured, this will be made available. Okay, so now we're looking at quite an important story this week on MEED.com, which was Iraq declaring force majeure on a number of its oil and gas contracts. And to expand on this a bit is Will Crisp, our oil and gas reporter covering Iraq. Will, perhaps you can explain in more detail what's going on there.
Thanks, Ed. So what happened on March 22nd was Iraq's government declared the ongoing COVID-19 crisis an event of force majeure for all projects and contracts. And obviously this is going to be mostly felt by the oil and gas sector, but it is all projects and all contracts. So you know, it's construction projects, it's energy projects, everything's affected by this. And just how they're going to be affected, we don't know yet. As everyone will probably already know, force majeure is a standard clause in contracts that typically frees both parties to the contract from liability when something beyond their control happens. Normally, under normal circumstances, this is decided by the parties to the contract, or ultimately it goes to court and it's decided by a court. What's highly unusual about what's happened in Iraq is that the Iraq government has stepped in and it said, you know, announced that this is a force majeure event for all projects and contracts without, you know, consulting the parties, contracts and things like that. So it's a very unusual step to take, and a lot of people don't really know what to make of it. It seems like the decision was made because they wanted to provide clarity to the industry, clarity to the construction sector about what was happening, and draw a line under the sand and answer questions about whether this was a force majeure event. They're saying yes, but because there is no precedent, a lot of experts are saying legally it's impossible to really know how to interpret this announcement, and it's actually caused a lot more uncertainty and caused more problems than it's solved in the short term, at least.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Some very good points there. As you said, it's unprecedented. Perhaps Indrajit, our oil and gas editor, have you seen similar moves elsewhere in the region, or potentially clients talking about force majeure, acting force majeure clauses in their contracts because of the coronavirus?
Thanks for the question, Ed, and hello to everyone tuned into this live webinar. I think apart from Iraq, there hasn't been any sort of declaration force majeure in other countries, although there have been rumors about because of petroleum, potentially moving to enforce force majeure on a few projects, but nothing's confirmed yet. No. Okay.
All right, good. Let's move swiftly on to the next slide because I want to give everyone enough time to answer everyone's questions. I can keep asking them, please, and we'll come to them in a bit. Staying with you, Indrajit, obviously coronavirus is the topic everyone's talking about, but perhaps in the longer term, we should be more worried about falling oil prices and the impact that those will have on government spending and the economy of the region. What's happening at the moment with regards to oil prices and where they're headed?
Well, oil prices this morning haven't done too badly. It's about $25 a barrel. I mean, this is in comparison to the rout that oil prices faced in the last few days. And obviously, let's not forget today is the 1st of April. It's what I've been calling D-Day in terms of regional oil production. So Saudi Aramco and ADNOC have gone full throttle with all their offshore and onshore assets in oil production. Aramco obviously has committed 12.3 million barrels per day for the month of April. Aramco, which was able to increase its spare capacity to 3.5 million barrels a day in 2018, they have committed 4 million barrels for this month. Long-term capital expenditure obviously remains in place. There hasn't been any sort of tampering with that. Although we touched upon this topic briefly last week, Aramco has revised its capital expenditure for this year to between 25 to 30 billion, which still remains a significant amount of project spending. Obviously that's what the whole host of the Saudi contracting community has their eyes on. They will obviously be waiting for the tender, which is not expected to be released anytime soon. I think revised estimates are that it might be tendered in Q3 of this year. Similarly, ADNOC is pushing ahead with a lot of its under execution projects. The Dalma project, which was recently awarded to Petrofac and in the minority portion to Sapura of Malaysia as well. Engineering work on that project has been started yet. Bid evaluation is going on for the Belbazem project by Al Yasad Petroleum, So yeah, project execution is going on as per plans. But the story is not same across the region, of course, beyond Abu Dhabi and Saudi. Project execution has slowed down, deadlines have been pushed back, and obviously contractors are find themselves in a hand-to-mouth situation to make ends meet.
And just talking about construction in general, I mean, I was reading this morning, and I'm seeing my own eyes as well, that construction activity on sites seems to be still proceeding. Is that the case, and what everyone else is hearing across the region? If anyone wants
Certainly
to
is for oil and gas.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the other sectors. Probably Colin will be able to shed light.
Yes, I think construction is continuing, but it's not at the usual pace. I think there's just naturally things are starting to slow down. There's a lot of precautions in place due to the virus situation. So, for example, in some countries there's curfew, so you can't travel around, so that's affecting working patterns. And then there's other things where labour has to work in separate shifts. They can't work together on site. Site offices have split up into shifts, so there's naturally an impact there on work that's proceeding at the moment. So that is slowing things down, and I expect that to continue. But I think at the same time, there's a desire for construction to continue. I think there's not many places in the world that have stopped construction. There's a lot of other non-essential industries that have been told to stop trading or work from home. And construction continues, and I think that's particularly important in the GCC in particular, where you have a large migrant workforce which is housed in camps. The alternative is for them to stay in camp where they can spread any potential virus just as much as they can as if they're at work. So I think the feeling is to try and keep it as productive as possible. But naturally, there will be some inertia, and that will slow things down.
Yeah, good points, Colin. I think if we saw the announcement from Abu Dhabi last week and announcing their stimulus, they did particularly specify that some of this money will be going towards accelerating projects. In their own words, I think this is a recognition of just how critical the construction sector is.
I don't think that was money for construction. I think that was more trying to reduce fees and get rid of some of the red tape, just to allow construction to continue moving. I don't think it was so much of a commitment to spend. I think that there'll still be pressure on cost, and that's something that I think is going to have to be dealt with further down the line. But at the moment, I think there's a will for construction to keep on moving.
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to that fact that I think everyone now recognises, especially after 2009, the crisis, how important it is to keep propping up the construction industry. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. Keep asking your questions, everyone. I see we've got a large number of questions, which we'll come on to. Quite a lot on oil and gas, which we'll come back to. Yeah, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box, and we'll come on to them in due course. Okay, so now to the power and water sector. There's been quite a bit of activity in the last couple of weeks. I guess power and water is one of those sectors where governments have little choice but to build capacity if the need is required. Jenny, our power and water editor, perhaps you could expand on what's been happening in the power and water market and how the virus is impacting the sector.
Right. Hi. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Ed. Right. So over the past week, we've seen the award, not the official award, but the SWPC in Saudi Arabia basically announcing that Aqua Power has been selected as the preferred bidder for Jubail 3A. So Aqua Power submitted a bid of 41 cents per cubic meter for the scheme, which is lower compared to the one offered by NG for Yanbu 4, which is of course, I mean, the fact that this project has been moving is somehow a positive for the industry. There has been some delays in other projects, and the fact that this project moved forward is basically, as I've mentioned earlier, a significant positive for the sector. On the downside, however, we've heard that the Egypt coal-fired plants have been shelved. Some of the Hamrawain coal-fired plant was the negotiations between the government and the preferred bidder, which is led by Shanghai Electric, has been holding negotiations since 2018, when they were appointed, they were named as the preferred bidder. But we now know that this project has been postponed indefinitely for 3 reasons. So first, we know that Egypt already has surplus production capacity after it commissioned over 15 gigawatt of thermal power plant to Siemens in 2014, when it suffered major outages because of its inability to cope with a peak load. Egypt does not necessarily need more capacity at the moment. The second reason is Egypt focusing on renewable energy. So during the in December, for instance, they've inaugurated the first phase of Benban solar park in Aswan, and there are more projects along the pipeline that are being tendered and for which pre-qualification are being done. And the third reason, of course, that people are speculating is that low oil prices make it difficult to justify building a coal-fired plant. So even the other coal-fired plant, which has been under negotiations for the past 5 years, has also been postponed indefinitely, and I think a 700 megawatt power plant is being planned to replace that original plan. Also this week we've seen we've talked about the utilities package, multi-utilities packages for the Saudi Arabia giga projects in Amala and Qiddiya. So that's again signs, and well, the Qiddiya is expecting bids by April 20, and Amala will be tendered over the course of the year. So again, these are positive signs, I guess, for the market. To answer some questions last week, there was a question about Tanajib and margin cogeneration. So what Saudi Aramco issued was a conditional letter of award. There has not been any official contract signing, but the hope is that they would be able to do that over the next few weeks or months when it's possible. Fujairah F3, which was awarded earlier this year, is also awaiting financial close. And the Al Dhafar Solar IPP, so EWEC and the Department of Energy confirmed that they are also postponing opening the final bids for the project. It was the intention of EWEC to award the project in the first quarter of this year, which of course is not going to happen. In terms of demand, we've seen, depending on who you're reading, who you're following, people are saying, some experts are saying you could possibly see a 10 to 16% contraction in terms of solar power demand, which would be the first time in 3 decades that would be happening. Other people are saying the drop in oil prices will boost renewable projects, because then the internal rate of return for renewables will be at parity with oil and gas projects, assuming oil prices remain at $20 to $30. So different sort of views at the moment, and I think largely people are watching what's going to happen over the next 4 to 6 months in terms of new projects. Absolutely, there will be some delay in terms of projects that are currently being implemented. So we're looking at the epicenter of the epidemic, of the pandemic, shifting from one geography to another. So I think most suppliers are really looking, most developers and contractors are really looking at options on how they can deliver projects, given the constraints in terms of supplies coming in from, or mainly from China, which is now coming out of this epidemic anyway. So the final point that I want to make that I'm hearing from people is that this this problem will potentially expedite localization projects, people building plants here, whether it's solar modules, whether it's inverters, among others, but which is of course part of the economic diversification plan. But given the low oil prices, I think if you're going to build here and which could cost more, then I think the big question is who will pay for the premium of building products here. So I think those are questions where we will have to wait and see for another 4 to 6 months before we would have clarity in terms of how the market will respond. And
thank you, Jenny. Very good points, and it's good to see that there's still some project activity in the power and water sector. As you say, it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time. Okay, so we've just come now to the end of our slides and our discussion points as part of this webinar. Just wanted to point that out to you that there is a report coming out imminently on the MENA projects market with an update included on the impact of the coronavirus on the projects market. If you wish to find more, of course, please go on to MEED.com, where you'll find more details about what the report and what it contains. Okay, so thank you very much, panelists. We are now going to go to the Q&A element of this webinar. Keep asking your questions, please. We've got a large number of questions, which I'm not sure we'll be able to answer all of them today. So if your question isn't answered, we have taken a note of it, and we will try and get back to you with a response in writing or by phone over the coming days. So don't worry about that if we don't answer all of your questions in the time remaining. Okay, so I'm going to take a broad mix of questions from different sectors. Let's start off with one of the first questions we got around the real estate sector in Dubai. Neha, Colin, perhaps you can answer this question. Does coronavirus mean the death of the real estate sector? A blunt question, maybe of a blunt answer.
It's going to make it very difficult to dodge the question a little bit. I think you've had ongoing pressure in Dubai anyway. You've had a problem with oversupply. I think the less talked about problem is the problem of under demand. I think the virus possibly slows down the delivery of some projects, so it might reduce the issue of oversupply over the next couple of years. But I think the bigger issue is that the virus is going to have a major impact on demand and cut demand quite significantly. So I think that's going to be a major problem going forward. What does that mean for real estate? I think it's going to be very difficult to see many new projects moving forward in the future. You're already seeing projects at early stages of construction being suspended. My expectation is that will remain the case. I think you'll probably also start to see something that we saw in 2008, 2009, where you have a developer that's got quite a large number of projects, and he might look to consolidate his portfolio of customers. So maybe shift buyers from one project to another to try and reduce the amount of the number of projects that he's delivering as he tries to reduce his costs going forward. So I think, yes, there's going to be a major impact on Dubai real estate. I'm reluctant to say it's the death of Dubai real estate. I understand why that question was framed the way it was. I think it's going to be severely difficult, and I think the real estate market as we know it and how it's been in the past will change significantly. That will not be the same. I would probably, just to add to that, say that change was probably coming anyway. I think what the virus has done is just accelerated it.
Okay, so and in the short term, what's the impact on the construction market? Are we going to see fewer deals, a slowdown in contract awards?
I think there's several things to touch on there. Projects that are being delivered at the moment, as I said earlier, I think will slow down, which will help soften that oversupply issue. I think some strategic projects will still be pushed forward quite strongly, but I would expect for the most part they will be slowed down. Then for new contracts being awarded, I'm not expecting any new work of significance to be awarded really this year. And then existing work, I would say that if it's got to a reasonable point of development. I think it will continue, but it will continue slowly. I think any project which is still, if you would say in the ground at the sort of foundation stage, I think its outlook is pretty likely that the client body will review and possibly put that on hold.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Moving over to the oil and gas sector side now. The question, as we saw earlier this week, or last week actually, ADNOC announcing that it planned, well, didn't announce, but wrote to suppliers and contractors saying it's asking for price reductions. Indrajit, can you expand a little bit on that? And is that something that we're going to see other NOCs try to apply, squeezing some of their supply base?
So some of the industry stakeholders I spoke to naturally have said that this move by ADNOC is not new. Even during the previous down cycle in the industry between 2014 and 17, ADNOC reached out to its supplier community, urging them for similar amounts of requests. What has a few contractors worried is the fact that projects which are at a very advanced stage of execution, which probably is in the 80 to 90% bandwidth, the client is now coming up to them asking for discounts of up to 30%, which is quite an alarming and starkly high figure. However, I mean, from ADNOC's perspective, one must realize that the oil price crash, which is now almost at an 18-year-old high, low, that's severely impacted ADNOC's business, and procurement model is the only way it can survive and revise its cost models. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of deemed as a necessary action on ADNOC's part.
Great, thank you. And going to back to that Iraq story, Will, someone's asked, does that cover Kurdistan as well? As we know, the Kurdistan region has slightly different clients and a different approach to the oil and gas sector. Is the force majeure applied there as well?
So it really remains to be seen how this is going to be interpreted. There's going to be a lot of people watching when it comes to these first kind of arbitrations between party contracts. I think it could very well impact projects in Kurdistan, and also, there's contracts which are governed by British law, not just Iraqi law in Iraq, and we're expecting those will be impacted by this as well in some way, even if they're not directly impacted by the announcement. Contractors will be able to say that to try and import this declaration into the foreign governing law contract by saying that they have been impacted by the announcement indirectly. So there is potential for, there's 260 billion of projects under execution in Iraq at the moment, and we're expecting that all of them could be impacted in some way by this announcement by the Iraqi government.
Well, it's a big number, isn't it? I mean, and it's something that may well just be the start of a number of force majeure clauses enacted throughout the region. Something we'll just have to keep a close eye on and watch very closely, which I know you're doing.
So one thing that is quite interesting is that, yes, what they've done in the short term has increased uncertainty, but over the long term, if subsequent guidance is given, there is the potential for extra guidance to be given. And if they say maybe if the Iraqi government says how the decree works as a matter of law, how the decree interacts with contractual provisions, how the decree impacts contracts that are not governed by Iraqi law, if they give the details and follow up in a way that makes sense and solves problems, it could actually in the long term cut through a lot of red tape, and then we could see it being used as a model by other countries in the Middle East and North Africa.
Okay, very good. I know MEED.com, on MEED you can see there are a couple of articles written by some of our legal contacts with regards to force majeure and what the virus means with regards to it. Now, there's a number of sort of general questions about banks and financing projects, whether it's the traditional project financing of big petrochemical complexes or other types of projects, and also banks financing PPP projects. Has anyone got a view on the economic situation, falling oil prices, and some of the credit pressures put on banks, and what that might have, what impact that might have on financing of some of these private projects? I think perhaps on the power sector and water sector, where there's a lot of IPPs, might have the biggest potential impact, as well as obviously some petrochemicals and oil and gas projects. Jenny, what are you seeing and hearing about that?
Well, based on what developers have been telling me over the past few days, I think the projects that are about to be awarded, or that have been awarded and are waiting financial close, are not seeing any potential delay or cancellation, because again, there are commitments for financing, and negotiations are continuing in terms of reaching financial close. I think we all agree, as in other sectors, that the risk would be on projects, on future projects. And I think the main, well, some people might disagree, but I think the main risk is if we're going to see delays over the next 6 months to 12 months, then assuming that we're able to get over this pandemic at the end of 12 months, then all the projects will be requiring financing once they come back to the market. So I think that scenario would mean there might be a limit. Some international investors or investment banks will be putting a cap in terms of their potential exposure per country or per sector, which means there might be a limit in terms of available financing for, let's say, for a project in Saudi Arabia or in Oman, which is of course have been suffering from major fiscal deficit over the past few years. So that scenario will mean cost of credit might be higher, and which would put into question the world record low tariffs that we've been seeing in the region. So I think that's but as of the moment, there's no banking crisis. Will there be one in the next 6 to 12 months? We don't really know. But as far as the power and water sector is concerned, I don't get the impression that that's a top priority at the moment. What they're looking at is being able to reach financial close for projects that have been awarded, and then review and reassess future projects in terms of which ones will have to go ahead and which will have to be postponed.
And thanks. And obviously, if you, as you're saying, if financing costs increase or risk appetite decreases amongst financing institutions, what might that mean outside the power and water sector, but to PPP projects and the development of PPP as a whole in the region? I know there's the drive to try and diversify the projects market away from primarily public sector financed and funded projects to those where the private sector is more involved. You know, and I guess this, with lower oil prices and with government expenditures lower, the impetus for this drive might increase. But I mean, obviously power and water is one thing, but PPP projects, whether it's hospitals or schools.
Well, you can argue that
Sure.
Yeah. I think you can argue that apart from demand being the main consideration for power and water projects, you can also perhaps argue that the reason that it's been more resilient than the other sectors is the fact that there's a greater amount of private sector participation in this sector. So on the one hand, you can say perhaps that if they push harder to get more PPPs in the social infrastructure sector, whether education, healthcare, or transportation, then maybe it will ease future sort of oil price slowdown, among others. So I mean, it's a hard sell, because as I've been mentioning in our internal discussion, so over the past 20 years, we're looking at PPP coming to the conversation every 8 years whenever whenever oil prices decline, whenever there's a crisis happening. But now it's becoming more frequent every 2 to 3 years that we're having some sort of slowdown or downturn. So I think maybe they have to consider looking at setting up the right framework and the right regulations to be able to get projects to the PPP route, and that would mean basically getting more private finance versus just relying on government funding for these projects.
Thanks, Jenny. Colin, any quick comments? Do you think the current situation is going to promote or accelerate PPP?
No, I think
PPP projects, or the opposite effect?
I think it'll slow it down. I think that, in my opinion, I think the problem's going to be that at the moment we've got a massive amount of uncertainty, and a lot of that uncertainty is over really fundamental things like population and demand. So even projects that were at a reasonably advanced stage, I think investors would be saying, hang on a minute, I want to relook at the demand here. I think you could be seeing significant changes in just the number of people, how those people behave, and that all feeds into demand. And if you're not sure what the demand is, your PPP is going to be challenged from the very start.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're coming slightly now towards the end of this webinar. So thank you very much for all your questions. I apologise if we weren't able to answer all of them, but we will come back to you. We've got a note of them, and we will respond to you in due course. Perhaps we could just finish off with each of the panelists giving their predictions or best guesstimates for what's going to happen in their sector, in the power, water, construction, oil and gas sectors going forward, and whether they think the market, how affected the market will be, and you know, in a nutshell, how long the implications of this will be, how serious they'll be. We'll start with you, Colin, left to right in terms of the panel. Quick 20 seconds nutshell of the main impact of this pandemic.
Projects largely continue through 2020, but will progress slowly. Then as we look to 2021, there won't be so much new work coming out. Projects will start to be completed, and that will be a problem as people have to adjust their businesses accordingly. And then we really need to look at what future work there'll be. I suspect it will be government type social infrastructure work, which will take the lead going forward, and there will be less projects, and I think it will be very, very competitive, given we've had a global downturn and international contractors all over the world will be looking for work.
Okay, so and then very briefly, which markets to target then, and where do you see the opportunity?
I think Saudi Arabia is as I was saying, I think demand's incredibly important, and I think Saudi Arabia's got the most robust demand.
Okay. Indrajit, Will, on the oil and gas side, what's your prognosis?
So there was a question that was asked last week as well, and including in the comment section. I'm reading the question about Hail and Ghasha. That project obviously is going on as per schedule. The recent commercial bid submission date has been set for the 22nd. Regarding, I mean, I saw there was a question about capex spending on that project, and especially coming from ENI side more than ADNOC. Eni obviously is in discussions with ADNOC, which is a majority partner. Obviously, there won't be long-term implications on the overall budget for the project, but there might be slight tweaks to the scope of the work going ahead, but nothing is official now. We are looking at a very sort of protracted timeline for this project. Overall, I think project spending will continue, especially in critical markets of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. These are the markets that contractors should be watching out for. The midstream sector, obviously, a lot of investments have already been earmarked in midstream hotspots like Fujairah, Ras and Jumeirah, and even Yanbu in Saudi Arabia. Downstream is the one sector which is probably taken the worst hit of the oil price crash. Obviously, refining margins have considerably slumped. And even for petrochemicals, there's an interesting conundrum for petrochemical producers now, in the fact that since the naphtha prices have come tumbling down due to the oil price crash, it's now more profitable for naphtha-based petrochemical producers to go ahead with their projects and enforce FIDs. So I think, yeah, I mean, downstream is the sector that's taken the worst hit, but upstream and midstream project spending will continue as planned.
Okay, so fairly sanguine about the prospects for the market in the short and medium term.
Yes, of course.
Okay, very good. And Jenny, on your thoughts on finally on the power and water sector?
Yeah, I think the different markets will have different the impact of this COVID-19 will be different for various markets. Definitely the demand for electricity and water for economies like Dubai and even Saudi Arabia, where you have a huge portion of the economy relying, let's say, on tourism and religious tourism, that will be affected. But overall, I think the containment measures plus the stimulus packages being offered in order to counter the effect of the economic contraction caused by the crisis will hopefully limit the impact in terms of people leaving the region, among others. So if they're able to limit the impact, the negative impact of this crisis, then my opinion is that most of the projects will continue, project spending will continue, IPPs we will go through the market, but maybe not in the same intensity that we have seen in the past 3 to 5 years.
Okay, thank you. So again, cautiously optimistic for the power and water sector. Good. Okay. Well, we've been on for an hour now, so I think we've reached the end of the allotted time for the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today and to listening in, and for your questions as well. Apologies again if we didn't answer all of them. I'm sure you can understand there's a lot of questions and not a lot of time to answer them. So please do feel free to contact the relevant journalists yourselves and have a chat with them. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer some of your questions and discuss things in more detail. Again, just to reiterate that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on both the MEED.com and MEED Project's websites in a couple of days once we've uploaded it, and you'll be able to again watch it in your own time. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much to the journalist team here today who've answered some questions and given their time up to give some insight into their sectors. And I just wish you all the very best and stay safe, and hope to see you again for our next webinar in the next couple of days. Thank you very much. Goodbye.